So we're here at Forestvale Cemetery today. Forestvale was formerly landscaped and platted out as in a response to Montana becoming a state in 1889. We needed a grand place to bury important people and politicians and that. And so Benton Avenue really didn't fill the bill anymore, and so Forestvale was opened in 1890. There are various sections for the Masons and for the veterans. Montana Children's Home, it has a section in the back, and on the other side of the chain link fence that you see over there is China Row, where about 200 Chinese residents of Helena are buried. So Forestvale is a very grand and beautiful cemetery. It was formerly laid out by Harry V. Wheeler, who was an engineer and also had some experience because he had laid out the city cemetery in Missoula in the 1880s. So enjoy the scenery and enjoy the stories that I will share with you. So our first stop is the family plot of the Spratts. Thomas Spratt was the sheriff in 1923. You guys probably have heard something about the Myrna Loy, which was the old jail. That jail building was built in 1890. And there are lots of stories that there are spirits there, but I always wonder if the spirit isn't Mrs. Spratt, because her husband in 1923 was cleaning his gun. Now the family lived in the upper story of the jail, and that was where the sheriff typically lived with his family. So the Spratts were in residence up there, and Sheriff Spratt was sitting at his desk cleaning his gun. Mrs. Spratt was apparently sort of perched on the edge of his desk, and she was going through the phone book. She was quite a club woman, and she was going to call people about a meeting or something, and she was looking up someone's number. And as she was going through the phone book and he was cleaning his gun, the gun went off and she was instantly killed. So I always wonder, because Mrs. Spratt died so violently and so quickly, whether or not she might be one of those spirits that is haunting the Myrna Loy, particularly the upper floor. So this is the tombstone of Myrna Loy. It's a very plain looking tombstone. She's buried with her family, the Williams family. And it's, you know, people always ask, where's Myrna Loy buried? And so I point that out. There's really nothing special about the tombstone. But really what I want to talk about is a little bit further down the way here. We're going to talk a little bit about Thomas Eddingfield, who's just across the way. Thomas Eddingfield was an interesting character also. He also was kind of a ne'er-do-well, and he was the first husband of Molly Burns, who was later known as Molly Weinsheimer. She is buried here, actually, in the cemetery under the name Weinsheimer, who was her second husband. Thomas Eddingfield, though, was her first husband, and it was during the time that she was married to him that she built her lovely residence at 212 State Street. If you don't know where that is, you should drive by it, because it is a lovely little home with two turrets on either end. And Molly had a very serious drinking problem, and so she wanted to build her home close to her business. Her business was known as the Castle, sometimes confused with the Bluestone House, but not the same. The Castle sat where the high-rise apartment is today, just down there in that neighborhood. You can't really miss that high-rise. At any rate, she divorced Thomas Eddingfield in the mid-1990s and married Willie Weinsheimer. He apparently was really after her fortune, and in 1900 he plied her with liquor, had her sign over her property to him, and she actually died of alcohol poisoning during that episode. They say that Molly's house, that sweet little house with the 2 turrets, is full of activity. There are apartments there today, and people who live in those apartments say that the party still goes on in Molly's house, because you hear laughing, you hear talking at night, and other kinds of sounds that we won't go into. Our next stop is Brother Van. Brother Wesley Van Orsdale, William Wesley Van Orsdale, was a well-known itinerant Methodist minister who came to Montana in 1872. He came on the steamboat and immediately got off the steamboat and began preaching. He was really not formally trained, but he was a singer, had a beautiful singing voice, and loved to sing hymns. And he also was quite a preacher, and so he immediately began preaching. He traveled all around Montana Territory, preaching sermons in saloons and in schools and in people's homes and on ranches. And he really made quite a name for himself. By the 1890s, he was pretty high up in the Methodist Church. And as you came into Johnson's Nursery, if you noticed that hollow building on the corner of Sierra Road and Montana, that is was the site of the Wesleyan University, which was founded by the Methodists in 1890. And actually there was a panic of 1893, a depression, and the city couldn't afford to run the trolley out to the campus anymore. And so the campus was actually abandoned, and the school moved in town into Helena. So the campus sat there vacant, and in 1909, Brother Van had this idea that he really wanted to open a school for kids. So he persuaded the Wesleyan board to allow them to use the campus as a school for kids. And in 1909, the Montana Deaconess School opened. It was staffed by deaconesses, which was the kind of the Protestant counterpoint to Catholic nuns. So the deaconesses ran the school, and Brother Van was always very involved. And he died in 1919, and the school then began to collect money to build a gymnasium on the campus. And the building that you see there that is so hollow and abandoned is what's left of the Wesleyan campus. It was the Van Orsdale Hall. It was called the Van Orsdale Hall in his memory, and it had just been completed the week before the earthquakes hit in 1935. And the entire campus was destroyed, and what you see is what remains there, just that brand new gymnasium that was never used. So the school moved into town, and the letters, Van Orsdale Hall, for a long time stood over the doorway of that building, and they were finally taken and stored by Intermountain, which is the sort of what the Deaconess School sort of morphed into. And Intermountain today is what used to be the Montana Deaconess School. So our next stop is John X Ebler. Does anyone recognize that name? I don't know. He's a pretty famous man in early Montana history, because Ebler was the famous executioner. When the vigilantes formed in Virginia City, Nevada City in the 1860s, there were probably at least 2 dozen men who were hanged. Some of them were probably guilty of whatever they were charged with, and some were probably innocent. But in any case, X Ebler presided over many of those hangings, and he really relished his job. He was apparently a very cruel person, and is rather famous for just loving what he did. He was later a U.S. Marshal, and died in Helena in the 1890s, completely destitute. So his friends collected the money to build this monument for him. Now, as we cross the road here, there's a row of little white tombstones that are for members of the Beech family. If you look at the dates, you'll see that at least 4 of them died in 1885. And this was during a very, very serious diphtheria epidemic. The Beeches had a ranch out in the Helena Valley, roughly where the Holter Lake is today. And so the children were very, very ill with diphtheria. Diphtheria is a horrible, horrible way to watch a child die, because what happens is a grayish membrane grows across the throat and the person suffocates. Usually it affects children. Usually adults don't become infected, but sometimes they do. In this case, 1885 was the worst epidemic that Helena had, and a number of children and even several adults died during this epidemic. But the Beech children were especially hard hit. And so when Holter Lake was flooded, these little tombstones were removed from the ranch and they were reburied here in Forestvale. Now, I point out this large tombstone of Preston Leslie, who was a territorial governor. We have a lot of governors and territorial governors who are buried here at Forestvale. But Governor Leslie, I point out his tombstone because if you touch it there and knock on it, you'll see that it's not actually stone, it's made of zinc. Zinc tombstones were popular between about 1900 and 1916 because they were cheap to make. They could be mailed easily or sent easily. You could have anything put on them that you wanted, and as you can see, they are very, very durable. Next we have Francis Pope, and he's buried with his family. You may be familiar with the Pope House over on Rodney Street. It's a big, beautiful mansion. Francis Pope was an early day pharmacist, and I know that he had a friend who passed away over a weekend, and this friend wanted to be sent back east to his family. In 1883, when the railroad came through Helena and through Montana, they had to pass laws that said that you couldn't ship a body out of the state unless it was embalmed, for obvious reasons. And so this friend of his died over a weekend, and there was no one to embalm him. And Francis Pope, had sort of dabbled in that. It wasn't a usual thing that mortuaries did back then, and in fact, there really weren't mortuaries as we know them today. Anyway, he took the body to his basement and embalmed the guy in the basement, and the guy could then be shipped back east. So I've always wondered if the Pope House might be haunted, at least by that guy. Next we have the large Kessler family plot. Nicholas Kessler, that name should be familiar to you because he was a very well-known brewer and also brick maker. We have a lot of Kessler bricks that are stamped with the Kessler name across Helena in a lot of different places. Kessler was one of the early brewers. He came to Helena in 1866 and actually took over another brewery. So his wasn't the first, but it was a very early one, and it wasn't very long that he began to manufacture bricks as well. If you notice the Civic Center downtown, the beautiful tile work that is on the facade of that building was made at the Kessler Brickyard. They also made sewer tiles and beautiful decorative tiles in later years. So Kessler really is a rather famous name here in Helena. I know one little story about the Kessler family. Mrs. Kessler died in 1889, leaving 3 kids. And so Nicholas Kessler was left to raise these 3 children, which he did really. He was a very benevolent father. He died in the early 1900s, and he wanted his daughter to marry well, but she fell in love with Albert Raleigh, who was rather a ne'er-do-well. Raleigh Street is named for his father. And Albert Raleigh was in love with her, and she was supposedly in love with him, and so they eloped. The brothers went after them, kidnapped her, and locked her in her room, and later had the wedding annulled, and she did end up marrying probably a better match. So anyway, the Kessler family is a very well-known family here in Helena. James Fergus was a rancher. In fact, he owned the Sebin Ranch, which is as you go out to Gates of the Mountains. He owned the Sebin Ranch very early on in the 1870s. He was named for Fergus County. So his daughter, Luella Gilpatrick, who is also buried here in the family plot, Luella Gilpatrick and her husband, Stephen, were the second residents of our pioneer cabin. And Luella is really important to Helena history because she was the one who brought the 2 little locust trees from Minnesota in coffee cans, and really nurtured those 2 little trees. If you go to the pioneer cabin, you can find the huge stumps that are to the side of the cabin. And the one tree that is on the corner there of the house is a baby of those 2 original trees. And it's said that those 2 trees that Luella Fergus Gilpatrick planted were the parent trees of all the locust trees that we have in this region. Bridget Ryan is our next stop, and no one really would guess who Bridget Ryan was, but she was a fairly famous person by the name of Lily McGraw. And Lily McGraw was one of 3 very wealthy proprietor madams in the late 1880s and 1890s. In fact, Lily McGraw was the person who built the Bluestone house. She built it as her residence. It was never a house of ill repute, as some people believe. But she wanted to build her residence close to her business, and her business was just at the foot of the Fire Tower Hill, just at the foot of the Bluestone house. And so she lost her fortune, though, in 1893 during the panic, the silver panic, and the house was actually never finished. It was never lived in. It changed hands a lot of different times, and finally, during the period of urban renewal in Helena, it was taken apart stone by stone, and every stone was numbered, and then it was put back together, and it is as it appears today. It is as it appeared originally. But again, it was really never used as a residence. Lily McGraw, along with Molly Burns, who is also buried here at Forestvale, who I'll come back to in a little bit. The third proprietor madam was Josephine Hensley, who was actually still buried underneath Robinson Park, which was the original Catholic cemetery. That's the little park that's over sort of by Helena High School on Oak Street. This is a very interesting group of tombstones here. Catherine Sly's beautiful Carrara marble statue is probably the most photographed tombstone in Helena, perhaps one of the favored places in Montana also. She was engaged to Thomas Marlowe, whose name was on the Marlowe Theater, which was destroyed some years ago downtown. But Catherine was engaged to Thomas Marlowe. He was a very wealthy banker in Helena, and the two were very much in love. When she passed away of rheumatic fever just very shortly before the wedding, it was devastating to Thomas Marlowe. Catherine's father was a doctor, and he couldn't even really do anything to help her. It was a rather sudden onset, and she passed away very quickly. So her fiance was very, very distraught, paid for the plot where she's buried here at Forestvale. His own tombstone is just down the way a little bit. And he also paid for the beautiful Carrara marble statue that you see on her grave. Marlowe was so distraught over her death that he never married. He didn't marry for 10 more years. And finally, when he did marry, he and his wife had a beautiful home over on the west side that recently sold, and I had a chance to sort of tour that house. They had an estate sale, and some of the original furniture was in the home. The person who was living there told me that Thomas Marlowe always kept a portrait of Catherine in the house, even after he married someone else. So not only is Catherine Sly's tombstone important, but also there's a very interesting story connected to Margaret Carleton, who's also buried right here next to her. Margaret's mother, Bessie, was the sister of Catherine Sly. It's a rather complicated family. But the story of Margaret Carleton is one of those really spectacular stories, Montana stories. Margaret was married a couple of times. Her second husband was a judge, Judge Carleton, and they lived in Havre. In the late 1910s, there was a very famous minister by the name of Leonard Kessler, who was an enigmatic character, very handsome minister, Episcopal minister. And all of the girls in Havre apparently were madly in love with him. He was just this very, very handsome man. And so Margaret became acquainted with him, had left her husband, the judge, and was hired by Leonard Kessler to travel with him as his secretary during the summer when he went on the Chautauqua circuit and gave lectures. So pretty soon there was a lot of talk about Margaret and the Reverend. And as they traveled around, the talk grew and grew, and eventually when they came back to Havre, Margaret suffered a mental breakdown. She was under the care of a doctor when she burst into the Kessler home late one night. And the story went that Margaret had a gun. She shot the Reverend through the heart and then killed herself. But, you know, it's a very tricky case because Mrs. Kessler was present when this happened, and she was actually never questioned. And the coroner's report did determine that it was a murder-suicide, but one of the doctors questioned whether or not Margaret was even in a condition, she was in such a weakened state, there was a big question whether or not she could actually have pulled the trigger once, let alone twice. So there were questions about this murder-suicide. So my friend John Axline, who is the Department of Transportation historian, he and I have both done a lot of research on this case. And John, at one point, a couple of years ago, his family, the Adami family, is buried around here near where this particular plot is. And he had some family issues he wanted to sort of iron out and had a good friend who was a psychic. So he took her there to the family, to the Adami plot, to see if they could straighten out these family issues. And as they were cutting back through the cemetery to get to the car, which was parked over on the road, they had to cut through the Sly plot here. And as they're cutting through, the psychic all of a sudden stopped and she said, "Wait just a minute, there's someone who's talking in my ear." And she pointed to Sarah, who was the grandmother of Margaret, who is buried right next to her. So she said, "Oh, this is Sarah's talking to me, and Sarah says she didn't do it. And wait a minute, there's someone else talking to me. Oh, and this is this person, Margaret, and Margaret says, no matter what they said, I didn't do it." So the psychic had absolutely no foreknowledge of this case or anything about it. And so you can take that with a grain of salt. But John and I both believe that Margaret was innocent of the murder. We think Mrs. Chrysler was the perpetrator. So we go just across the road here, and after talking about the Carlton and Sly plots there, the Davenports were also related. So again, it's kind of complicated family. Margaret Carlton was a Davenport, so she is related to these tombstones here. But the Davenports were really important, Rachel and William Davenport, because they were the original occupants of what is now the Cotton Top Bakery. Cotton Top Bakery was a contemporary cabin next to the Pioneer Cabin down at the south end of Last Chance Gulch. And the Davenports came here, had a very seriously bad trip up to Montana. People oftentimes came by covered wagon, but sometimes they came by steamboat. And Mrs. Davenport and her family, actually the family ranch or plantation was devastated during the Civil War. So the family had relocated to St. Joseph, Missouri. And Mr. Davenport decided to follow the gold rush up to Helena, had staked a claim, built the cabin. And as he built the cabin, he notified the family that he had a place for them. And so Mrs. Davenport was waiting in St. Joe for word that she should board a steamboat to come up to Montana. Received that word, bought their passage on the steamboat. But before they could board the steamboat, one of their 4 children, the youngest one, died. We don't know what this baby died of, but they buried him apparently on the banks of the Missouri River underneath a tree. So the remaining family consisted of Willie, who was about 6, and Sally, who was 8, and Anna, who was 10. So the 3 children and Mrs. Davenport boarded the steamboat, and they began traveling. There were lots of families on this steamboat, on this particular steamboat, the St. John, as they made their way up to Fort Benton. They'd only been traveling a couple of days when a terrible measles epidemic broke out on the ship. And all the children were very, very ill, including all 3 of the Davenport children. So when they finally docked at Fort Benton, only Sally had really recovered. She greeted her father at the dock, led him down to the stateroom where the family had been staying for the weeks of the journey, and Mr. Davenport pulled his chair up next to Willie's bedside as Willie closed his eyes for the last time. They bribed the steamboat captain to pack Willie's little body in charcoal and take him back down the river and bury him under the tree next to his sibling. We don't know for sure that happened, but we hope that it did. Anyhow, that left Anna and Sally. They moved into this little cabin next to the Pioneer Cabin that the father had built. It's now the bakery here on Last Chance Gulch. And we have this wonderful reminiscence of Sally. She wrote when she was much, much older. She wrote about what it was like to be a resident of the mining camp and what it was like to live in this little cabin during the summer of 1865. She tells us that it was very rainy that summer, and there was a sod roof on the cabin, and the sod roof just soaked up water like a sponge. And 2 weeks after a good rainstorm, the interior walls of the cabin would be running with mud. You can imagine there was a dirt floor. You can just imagine, and the horrible conditions, living in mud all the time like that. And all the time, Anna was very, very ill. And she did pass away in September. And the interesting thing about that reminiscence, the important thing about it, is that Sally says we buried Anna in the place where Central School is today. And that's really the first mention of the mining camp cemetery. It tells us exactly where it was. And so it's a really valuable reminiscence. So the Davenport family is really very important to early Helena history. Right next door, we have the Christmas Gift Evans tombstone. And this is an interesting story because Christmas Gift Evans' house on the west side, on the corner of Lawrence and Benton Avenue, is probably the most haunted house in Montana. There are many, many stories about the house. But first of all, let me just tell you a little bit about Christmas Gift Evans, who was an early day businessman. He had an agricultural implement business that was very lucrative. He and his partner, John B. Sanford, built homes on the west side, and after a couple of years, in about 1872 or so, they traded houses, which was a fairly common thing to do back then. I mean, there was a feeling that you would have bad luck, actually, if you lived in a house that you built yourself. So it was not a real unusual thing for people to trade houses like that. So the beautiful Christmas Gift Evans house was lived in by the Evans family from the 1870s until the 1970s, when the family finally went out of the family. But Christmas Gift Evans' two wives died in the house, and Christmas Gift Evans himself in 1915 was suffering from circulatory problems, and so his physician decided that the only course of treatment really would be to amputate his leg. The surgery was performed in the house. Christmas Gift Evans seemed to be recovering pretty well, but then at midnight he took a turn for the worse and passed away. Now, when a person has a limb amputated, they had the option of either having the limb buried or having it incinerated. We don't know what choice the Evans family made, but there was a place here at Forestvale, down at the end of the cemetery, where they did bury limbs that had been amputated. So it's possible that Christmas Gift Evans' leg ended up down there. And it's also possible that Christmas Gift Evans doesn't know where his limb ended up. He was probably buried without it, which might explain why at least one legislator in 1995 rented a room in the house and had a really horrific experience 3 nights in a row. There was this horrible banging around the foundation of the house, and I always wonder if it's not Christmas Gift Evans banging for the loss of his leg, wondering where it went. There are other stories about the house. If you read my Haunted Helena book, there's a whole chapter on the house, including the story of our Lieutenant Governor Mike Cooney and his wife, who also had experiences in the house. But at any rate, Christmas Gift Evans can be remembered as a person who might be really haunting a beautiful home over on the west side. Across the way here, the Prescott family is also very important to Helena and to Montana. Alonzo K. Prescott was Montana's first prolific tombstone maker. You can walk around most any Montana cemetery and find his signature on the side of tombstones. There are some of those here in Forestvale as well. A.K. Prescott he started his tombstone business here in Helena in 1884, also had a branch in Butte, and by about 1890 he had made 3,000 tombstones that were scattered all over Montana. So a really very important family. Next we come to the Brown Mausoleum, which is the only mausoleum, family mausoleum here at Forestvale Cemetery. Mrs. Brown is buried here with her first husband, who was the builder of the Brown Block, if you know where that is, over on Warren Street, sort of in the vicinity of the jail, of the Lewis and Clark County jail. The Brown Block is one of Helena's oldest brick buildings. So Mr. Brown is buried here, Mrs. Brown is buried here, and her second husband, whose last name was Dresser, she's buried under the name Dresser. So 2 husbands and Mrs. Brown are buried here. Again, across the way we have the Sanders family plot. Wilberforce Sanders was a really important person in the construction of the laws of territorial Montana. He was an attorney. He was the organizer of the vigilantes in Nevada and Virginia cities in the mid-1860s, was a grand speaker and a great attorney, moved to Helena in 1875 when the territorial capital moved here. And his home is now a bed and breakfast over on the corner of 7th Avenue and Ewing. And the house was owned by the Sanders family until the late 1920s. But the one story that I want to tell you about has to do with James U. Sanders, who was his son. He's also buried here. James U. Sanders was the librarian for the Montana Historical Society in 1923. At that time, the Historical Society was located in the basement of the Capitol building. And James was wanting to create a territorial exhibit on the vigilantes. And so if you know anything about Helena history, you know that we did have a hangman's tree where at least a dozen people we know of were hanged. And it's my contention that around in that area on Blake Street between Hillsdale and Highland, where the tree sat, in that vicinity, some of those victims were actually buried close by. In fact, remains have surfaced 2 different times, once in 1900 in the backyard of a person in that neighborhood, and another time in 1933 when on Davis Street, when they were adding some or changing the gas lines there. So the remains that were discovered in 1900, the skull was taken by Dr. Brooks, who was coroner at that time. He took the skull, had it in his office apparently for a couple of decades, and in 1923 he took that skull and handed it over to James U. Sanders, and Sanders placed it in a glass case for public display. Now, we don't display human remains anymore. It's illegal to do that. But at that time, it wasn't illegal, so he placed the skull in this case. 2 weeks later, James U. Sanders was hit by a car and killed. And so, you know, you don't want to handle human remains and you don't want to speak ill of the dead. Finally, our last story has to do with Laura Duchesne, who has this lovely sort of reddish granite tombstone with her husband. Mrs. Duchesne was a French woman. She had a wonderful accent. She was quite famous in the neighborhood and was a resident of the Stone House at Reader's Alley. She has become fairly famous for her canaries. The Stone House, where her apartment was between 1918 and 1933, when she passed away, has become very famous because many people have heard the canaries in there. Mrs. Duchesne was apparently a breeder of canaries. And if you can just imagine, in a small little, almost one-room apartment, hundreds of little cages of canaries, you can just imagine what kind of noise they might have made. But in that little apartment, she also did something else that we discovered. She sold moonshine. And she was rather famous for her moonshine, and in fact, her occupation there at the Stone House coincides exactly with the years of Prohibition here in Montana, 1918 to 1933. And people used to come to her apartment at certain times of the month, and they would line up all the way down to Park Avenue to buy moonshine. But they were terrified that the revenue officer would come around and ask them what they were lined up for. And so she would bring all of her canaries in their cages and line the alley with the canaries. So if anyone asked, people could just say, well, we're here to buy canaries. So canaries were really kind of the front for her moonshine business. And, you know, it's true that people still hear those canaries. Their residual energy, you know, is really pretty strong. And one little story, a recent story, a couple of years ago, there was an intern when the Montana Preservation Alliance had its offices there in the Stone House. The intern was sitting at his computer about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It was close to Christmas time. And all of a sudden, he began to hear this beautiful bird song. He thought it was outside, but again, it was blizzarding outside in the dead of winter. And he said he sat there for about 10 minutes and listened to this beautiful bird song. And finally, the next morning, he told a coworker, you know, that he'd been alone in the office and had heard that. And she said, oh, you've heard Laura's canaries. Laura's canaries do sometimes they don't make an appearance, but you can certainly hear them. And birds are a big part of Reader's Alley anyway. If you walk through the alley and you hear the wind in the trees, most often you can hear many, many, many different kinds of birds chattering in those trees, but they're hard to find. You can't really see them. So try that next time you walk through Reader's Alley.